So you've had a chance to make an entry into your journal on this subject. Let's see how what you wrote down factors in comparison to some of the information we want to share here. So let's look at some common elements of crisis. First, we need to understand a term, decompensation, which we will often use interchangeably with the word crisis. To a person who is observing an individual decompensating, what it would normally look like is the person's symptoms are flaring up or are worsening, when in actuality, probably a better description is that their coping mechanisms are simply not adapting or keeping pace with stressors in their life. The individual may not be worsening, but their normal ways of adjusting and managing their stressors may not be working as well. And that could be something like medications are simply not keeping up, or it could be some of the normal sort of psychosocial life skills that people bring to bear in terms of dealing with stress. So they are showing an inability to adapt to needs such as fatigue or illness. Now, I have to mention that compensation as a concept is not limited to people with mental health needs. We all compensate. So we do this in a variety of ways, both internal and external. For example, we make decisions or we reframe the way that we think about the world when we're encountering stress. Let's say, for example, we've had a particularly busy week. We might decide to socialize with some friends on a Friday night to get a bit of an escape. Or we might have had a very stressful day interacting with somebody else and need to speak to somebody whom we trust, like our parents, and use that as a way of ventilating and reorienting our thinking. Or we might have had a very tiring week, or we might have been ill and we decide to sleep in or to spend a day at home in bed. That takes me to the second way we typically tend to compensate, which is to rely upon external resources such as social supports or policy mechanisms that exist in our world. For example, let's say we have a death in our family. We might rely on some official sort of supports in the form of the policy where we work that might allow us to take a week off with pay. But we might also rely on some informal assets. Perhaps our neighbors come over and console us. Maybe they bring us a bunch of frozen food that we can eat more easily during this time because we may not feel like cooking. So these are some examples of things that we all rely upon to help us compensate for day-to-day stressors. And where a stressor is something that is particularly significant, we often give that a name, such as bereavement or grieving. But there are a lot of times in the lives of individuals where stress cannot be identified as one sort of trauma. It often comes as almost a bolus of little tiny stressors, all cumulatively having an impact. And in fact, research has shown that people often cope more poorly with that because it's an insidious type of stress, very much like the old metaphor of turning the water's temperature up with the frog in the pot. The frog doesn't recognize that its threat is a threat and stays in the water and is overwhelmed before it knows it. And we all can go through this, but it's particularly possible for people who may not possess the internal or external resources that they need for coping. Mental illness on its own rarely causes a person to have recurring mental health crises. So the initial mental health crisis may be significant. It may send a person off to a clinician to get supports. But typically, the most common response to that seeking of support is that a person is able to either manage or even, I don't know if we want to use the word cure, but successfully treat their mental health symptoms. And so for most people, that initial crisis is the worst and perhaps the only crisis that they'll experience because they learn how to manage their mental health needs. For first responders, we may assume, because we typically only see people with mental health needs when they're going through these crises, and sometimes we'll see people who recurrently come into our care, but that doesn't mean that's what the average individual with mental health needs is experiencing. We should also mention that mental illness on its own may not really bring a person to the point of the sort of crisis where they're engaging emergency room staff or BC ambulance or police. Most people will have their crisis in a way that is evident to them, maybe to their closest family and friends only, and then they'll seek care before they decompensate to the point that they have a complete dysfunction in their life. One of the reasons that a lot of people who are struggling with mental illness sometimes do have recurrent issues or have difficulty managing their mental health symptoms is that they have yet to develop a sense of resiliency. And we've talked about that and will talk about that as a concept throughout our course. And we've said that resiliency is not the same thing as being strong or tough or detached from all things that would bother us, but instead it basically means that we have a whole constellation of skills, internal and external resources that we can go and attach ourselves to. And these are often referred to now as assets. And we possess not only the ability to manage different kinds of stress, but also the ability to perceive when we're under stress and to correctly use the right mechanisms for responding. Now, we don't have the time in this course to look into this in great detail, but I would encourage you to spend a few moments and look up defense mechanisms is the correct terminology from people like Anna Freud and George Vaillant. And in fact, I don't normally recommend Wikipedia as a source, but I can tell you that the Wikipedia page on defense mechanisms is actually a pretty good summary. And if you look at the bottom of that page, you'll see that there are a variety of different defense mechanisms. Some of them are identified with youth who, when you read them, you may say, well, that explains why a lot of younger people are sort of going through this evolutionary process of trying to find the right coping skills and sometimes struggle with that. But you will also see that there are a number of functional, very effective defense mechanisms. Some of them, for example, like using humor as a way of managing our stressful situations. We need to know what tool to pull out of the toolkit when we're encountering stress. And I like to use the example of the Serenity Prayer, which is often spoken of in 12-step programs for people who are going through dependency treatment would use. And it goes like this. Lord, grant me the strength to change the things I can, the serenity to accept the things I cannot, and the wisdom to know the difference. And I don't use that as an example to promote faith or anything of that order here, but to talk instead about the idea that we were in that prayer summarizing a bit of resiliency. The idea that an individual would use strength and other elements of skill that could help them to change the world in some circumstances, and in others might use mechanisms to help them accept something unchangeable, such as, for example, reframing or worship. And then the other skill that's mentioned there is discriminatory ability, the ability to be able to tell the difference. That is at the root of not only what many people with addiction need to come aboard, need to understand, but many people with mental health needs in general. And we're going to talk about this in just a couple of bullet points. Many of them have not fully seen how that can be done in their childhood and youth. They've lacked models who could demonstrate that, or they've lacked social experiences, lack of interaction with others where they get to test their social skills and develop them. Resiliency then is a whole catalog of skills, the ability to really be flexible and adaptable when managing a variety of different stressors. So they're coping skills and they're social skills. Coping skills, we often think of things we would tell ourselves internally. Social skills are things we might do to engage support from other people. But we can also talk about the other part of that, because we have to have people, we have to have internal skills, and those things collectively are called often now assets. And you may hear people speak about asset building approaches as a way of helping people struggling with mental health needs, and in particularly substance dependency. So what we're doing if we're trying to use an asset building approach is address this lack of assets by giving people abilities, improving their confidence, improving what we call social virtues. Social virtues are things like understanding, patience, kindness, generosity, and we want people to understand that when we give those things, we often get those things. Support, literally helping people to have a range of social supports in their life, financial resources, and all the things that are incumbent with financial resources, such as housing and appropriate clothing and food and nutrition. Information and access, and I want those things to be thought of together, information and access to care. So we can have the world's greatest service, and we've talked about this probably a few minutes ago here, but if we don't have a way for people to know about it or to get to it, then those assets really undermine the ability of them to use any of those supports at all. One of the things that's common for many people is that they report they have low self-esteem. Now, their self-esteem may seem low to us because they have a mental illness and they have to deal with the stigma associated with that. And there is some of that. But in many cases, people suffered from low self-esteem in the first place because they may not have been given enough of those social indicators that help people to develop self-esteem as they were developing. So that's just one reason why they may experience it. But if people are isolated, if people have had chronic failure, if they have not had good models or mentorship, they can develop low self-esteem. And low self-esteem is, or self-esteem, I should say, period, is a significant asset for people in terms of developing good compensatory skills. They may have a history of parental or familial instability, poverty, or trauma, or a combination of these things. So if their parents have not been around, or if their parents have suffered with mental health needs or addiction needs on their own, then they may have lacked the sort of models that are developmentally critical to people if they're going to learn how to manage stress as they get older. People who are poor sometimes develop an inner resourcefulness, but the research also shows that they often go through cycles of poverty. They don't know a different way of life. And trauma, as we all probably understand, can have a significant impact on us. And in fact, we should take a moment here to talk about the idea that the research shows that going through major trauma, like for example, rape, assault, or going through war, actually makes physiological changes in our brain. It changes which parts of the brain light up, where there's more neurotransmitter activity, where there's more electrical activity, and as a result, it's actually a neurological change that's going on in there. It's not just the way that our thinking occurs. And there's often a historical mental illness that has gone on in a person's family. In other words, this is something that is an individual has grown up with a mother who has dealt with schizophrenia, and that meant that there may have been some challenges in terms of the parenting of that child. For example, I've worked quite a lot with families where the mother was depressed and later on one of their children became depressed, and because the youth didn't really have a model that they could look to see how to deal with that, they often suffered more. They didn't have the parent they could call and talk to about this, and they didn't have the parent who existed as a good example of how to cope with it. Isolation is our last factor we want to talk about here, and it's both social and physical isolation that we're talking about. People who are socially isolated are more likely to go through crisis or recurrent crisis, and people who are physically isolated are also in this circumstance. Physical isolation, partly because it keeps you from socializing, but also because it might keep a person from literally accessing healthcare or even appropriate food and that sort of thing. And so you can see why the effects of isolation, when we talk about homeless people, compound the crisis. Makes it much harder for them to get stable, and makes it much more likely that the individual is going to keep getting engaged with the system. So you can see why, as first responders, we want to help people through that initial crisis and then help to address some of their underlying needs in terms of their physiological needs and so forth. And we'll speak more about that in Module 2. So is crisis inevitable or avoidable? Well, luckily, it's avoidable or at least mitigable in most cases. Mitigable meaning it can be reduced. And we can reduce it in terms of its severity or acuteness, as well as in terms of its duration, or both of those things. In order to do that, we really need to have a relationship with the individual. And that relationship will be founded on a certain amount of trust. That relationship allows us to be able to get to know the person and be able to check in with them regularly, not just when they're in crisis. It allows us also to know the person when they're at their baseline or their stable state, and therefore we get a better sense of what it looks like as they start to decompensate in the early stages or escalate. We don't therefore need to wait until the person's in the most acute realm of their decompensation before we intervene. We can get them help early, and early help generally is more effective help. And it allows us to come in and actually ask a person sincere questions about how they're feeling and how they're doing, instead of just the small talk version of how are you. So relationship is really critical, but we need to understand that in order to get to that point where we have a monitoring relationship, we need to get past some of the distrust that many mental health consumers will have, because many of them have had negative experiences with first responders or with even later stages in the care system. So they are often reluctant to trust. And this is part of the reason why you'll see people doing outreach programs. And for those of you who don't know that term, an outreach worker is somebody who literally goes out into the community and interacts with people on the park benches or underneath the overpasses or in the tent communities or wherever they may find them, and just gets to know the individual, and it can take some time. The other way that this is happening is what we call harm reduction programs and first stage programs or gateway programs. All of these programs have in common that they offer the individual some sort of physical amenity first. They may come in for coffee, they may come in for a shower or to do their laundry or to sleep overnight in a shelter. And they do that without there being the pressure to do more. They're not getting pressurized to join in with a program at that point. But as they come in and repeatedly use that program, they get to know the individuals who work there more and gradually begin to become more and more open to receiving more advanced types of care. And we're going to talk later on about something called stages of change in one of our later modules. And this is one of the things we want to understand, that this can take some time. And if we understand how stages of change work, we can facilitate or catalyze that process. It may not happen rapidly, but we can make it happen more rapidly than it might otherwise have happened. Our ultimate aim is to help that individual develop both internal and external assets. And by internal, we mean, again, internal coping mechanisms, ways of thinking, social skills that they can utilize, decision-making things that they can utilize, discriminatory ability, the ability to tell situation A from situation B. And external assets are things like money and social supports and homes and doctors and medications and all of the things that a person needs to have in their toolkit physically. That's going to take some time, and we're going to spend more time in modules 2 through 8 talking about how to actually build up that toolkit. It's very important for us to understand that this is more difficult for people when they have reached adulthood or late adulthood. We normally develop these assets, internal and many of our external assets, in our childhood, I should say, and our adolescence. And if we haven't gotten them by the time we are into our 20s and 30s and later, our plasticity, our ability to catch up, is still present, but it reduces somewhat as we get older. And you've all heard the term, you can't teach an old dog new tricks. Well, it's not completely accurate. You can, but it's more difficult. And as we get beyond the age of 30, we become senescent. And senescence means that we reduce our resiliency. We become somewhat less able to respond to stressors in our life, whether it's germs and viruses or bruises or aching muscles, or whether it's life stresses. And so we often find that we lose about 1% of our ability to respond to stress every year after the age of 30 per year. It's depressing, I know, but there are things we can, of course, do to keep ourselves better able to respond, from exercise to nutrition to being socially and mentally active. But it's important for us to be always mindful and understanding of the idea that teaching something to somebody at, for example, 35 years old that they should have learned at 15 isn't as easy as the outside world typically thinks. We often believe that person should just automatically be able to accept it. But it took us years to develop these internal and external assets. And that's why we're going to talk more in the next section about a model called PSR and how that helps us to look at helping people to accommodate themselves in terms of their immediate crisis or their immediate needs, as well as gradually move forward in developing better life skills, better thinking ability, and better social and other assets.